Okay, so this month our webinar is about the role of marketing and flagship species in mainstreaming biodiversity. Campaigns featuring flagship species they're really a key part of conservation education efforts, but the use of these flagships is often based on gut feelings or instinct or convenience and really lacks a strong evidence base. And this impacts our understanding of how the effectiveness of campaign outcomes. So in our webinar, I'm very happy to present our speaker, Dr. Diogo Verissimo, who is going to talk about his research conducted at 2 study sites in Northeast Brazil and talk about how the field of marketing can provide important theoretical support for the use of flagship species in conservation education campaigns. I want just a little bit of background about our presenter. Diogo works at the interface between social and natural sciences with a focus on behavior change and evidence-based conservation. His work has taken him beyond his native Portugal to Central and South America, India, Sri Lanka, where he has worked on environmental education, social marketing, community-based conservation, and natural resource management. Diogo has an undergraduate degree in environmental biology from the University of Lisbon, a master's degree in conservation biology, and a PhD in biodiversity management from the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent. He is currently a David H. Smith Conservation Fellow researching the impact of conservation programs aiming to change human behavior and the application of social return on investment metrics. Diogo also writes regularly in the popular press and manages a biodiversity-related social media platform with more than 16,000 followers. So I could hear that we had some folks call in while I was going through that presentation. So just to reiterate, if you could please mute your phone, either with the mute function or hit *6 to mute yourself, that would be great. Diogo, I'm going to pass control over to you so you can
Sure. All
set
right,
up,
yeah.
and we'll get going here.
All right. Let's see. Yeah, does that work?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay. All right. Great. So yeah. So thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to share a bit of my experience with all of you. So today I'll talk to you a little bit about marketing and the role of flagship species in getting the message about biodiversity out. And so I'll start talking a little bit about the term conservation biology, which is a term that perhaps many of us identify with as conservation biologists, for example. But it's interesting, the actual term, what it means, considering, for example, that we live in an age called the Anthropocene, where a lot of the environmental processes are impacted by, or pretty much all of the environmental processes are impacted by what we do every day. And so the fact that we still call it biology, the fact that we still really focus on the natural sciences, can have as implications. So, in the same way, if you look at how we defined conservation biology, what conservation biology was about, say 40 years ago when it started. If you look around, this is from a paper from Michael Soule's about initial 72, I think it was, and this was his conception of conservation biology. So you see a lot of natural sciences, a lot of fishery biology, wildlife biology, population biology, genetics, physiology, 2 types of biogeography, and then on the side a little bit of social sciences there, a little bit of social sciences as well, and I think that contrasts nicely if you compare with what has become the vision for conservation science a few years later. A little bit of there we go. Yeah, so I think that contrasts nicely with the vision that Peter Cariva, for example, has for conservation science. Something that is published recently. And if you look at some of these things that pop up that are new, that did not come up in the initial definition of conservation biology a couple of decades ago, you'll see things like anthropology, communication, psychology, sociology. And the reason I'm really bringing this up is because I really think this change highlights not only where we are right now, but also where we're probably going towards in the next couple of decades. So I guess a lot more focused on the human dimensions of conservation biology, on what people do, why people do things, and how can we get them to do things perhaps a little bit differently, and in a way that impacts environments less. And this is how I really got involved in marketing and really thinking about how can we use this set of techniques, this set of tools to benefit biodiversity. And it's a bit of it's a tough gig sometimes being involved in marketing, because when you come up to someone and say, hi, I do conservation, I work around marketing, the image people have of marketing is sort of like that. I mean, it's a little bit something that companies use to deceive customers, and something that is used in a little bit of a sort of a naughty way, or even worse. I mean, it's really just it's really part of a sort of a conspiracy type set of techniques that we use to sort of cover up things when something goes awfully wrong. So it sometimes can be a little bit tough to say that you work in marketing. When you use marketing to have an impact in biodiversity. But I think the key thing really is that and this is often the example that I use. It really is the tip of an iceberg. I mean, as with any other set of techniques, marketing techniques can be used for many different purposes, ethical or unethical. The example I always give is statistics. Statistics are wonderful set of tools that can be used for a variety of purposes, and some of them are better than others. And it's exactly the same way with marketing techniques and with the way that we use marketing as a tool for conservation in this case. So I really want to start this with going over what is marketing. What is that thing that we call marketing? And I'll start in sort of a more conventional sense, and then I'll translate that into something that's perhaps a bit more meaningful to all of us in terms of what we do every day and the things that we care about. So in a more sort of corporate sort of type of way, marketing is basically this. You have a collection of sellers, a bunch of buyers. They exchange products and services for money, and then you have this feedback loop where you have the sellers communicating with the buyers to tell them what they should be buying, and then the buyers then feeding the information back to the sellers, either through what they actually buy, so their behavior, or through what they recommend to their friends, or so it could be indirect or direct feedback loop. So this is very crudely what marketing really is. It's about creating these relationships about buyers and sellers. Now, this might look a little bit far away from the things that really matter to us, but I'll translate this in just a minute. But I really want to get down to what marketing really is. So I'll start with a really, I think it's really popular example, Coca-Cola. And I'd like to go ahead and ask if anyone can tell me what does Coca-Cola sell? Anyone?
Coca-Cola. Soda. Happiness.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Any other examples? What other things does Coca-Cola sell?
Cute polar bears.
All right. Okay.
Bottled water.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So that's the point I was trying to get at. And the point I was trying to get at is that if you boil it down to the actual product, the physical things Coca-Cola actually exchanges with us, it's basically fizzy, sugary water. It boils down to that. It's this sort of fizzy, sugary drink. It's not particularly unique. It's not particularly special, and it's also not why people actually buy it. If you look at a little bit of the advertising that Coca-Cola does worldwide, for example, these are all recent ads from Coca-Cola. You'll see that it's not really about the drink. It's about other things. It's about the social impact, social recognition of what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it mean if I drink a Coke? What does it make me? So it's a lot more of that other sort of intangible value. Now I'll come back to this sort of concept again. This value that's not necessarily what the product actually is, but is added to the product by the way Coca-Cola presents what it sells and presents itself. And so I think this is also something that we can actually learn quite a lot, because a lot of time people will say, well, biodiversity is a tough sell because it's not, it doesn't give you something tangible, doesn't put dollars in your pocket end of the month, at least dollars you can see, you can easily see in your wallet. Well, a lot of the industry is also about creating this value that is intangible. So I think we can learn from that as well. It's also interesting. I mean, if you look at, say, what was going on 50 years ago. 50 years ago, Coca-Cola was advertising itself like this, and that was just basically saying, drink a Coke, you won't be thirsty. But the problem with that sort of message is that any other drink can say the same thing. Any other drink can say, drink a bit of water, drink a bit of tea, drink a bit of anything else, you won't be thirsty. It's sort of a lot more tangible. Are you thirsty? Are you not thirsty? Now, if you pick up these other things that Coca-Cola is building around its brand, this other social impact, the social recognition that it gives you when you drink a Coca-Cola, then that is, once you have that built around your brand, that's a lot more, it's much more difficult to replicate, and that's the real value that Coke's going for. The other thing, the reason I chose Coca-Cola was because of the impact that the company has had through its marketing efforts in even really sort of quite crucial aspects of Western culture. So things like Santa Claus. So Coca-Cola didn't actually create Santa Claus, but it did standardize our concept of Santa Claus. So if you go back, say, 80 years or 100 years, you would have green Santas, skinny Santas, Santas with black hair, brown hair, Santas without beards, all sorts of different Santas. And Coca-Cola was really one of the big responsibles for this standardization of the image of Santa Claus across the world. And Santa now dominates Christmas, which is the biggest holiday worldwide. I mean, Jesus is out, Santa Claus is in. So it really, I think it really shows how these efforts, these marketing efforts, can really have a big impact, even in really quite sort of fundamental aspects of what we regard as our sort of cultural, of our culture, basically. So what? So this has all been very sort of geared toward the industry. What does this actually mean in terms of, say, changing behavior for biodiversity or managing biodiversity? Well, if you go back to that first diagram that I showed you with the buyers and the sellers, there's actually quite an easy way to reframe that diagram in a way that's more meaningful. And this is the way I usually frame it. And that is that all of us are trying to communicate with target audience, with a group of people. And what we try to do usually is try to show them what is the value that we're trying to give to them and why they should change, in exchange, change their behavior or do something a little bit different. Now, one of the issues that you have with many conservation campaigns is that obviously often we forget about the value part. We are all about asking people to do things, but we don't really make it explicit what's in why they should that, why they should engage with us, why they should do as we ask them to do. So there's those two aspects. So then there's also the other thing is exactly the same way. We have also a communication strategy that we use to communicate with our target audience, to explain to them why it's positive, why this is good, and at the same time we have an information feedback loop when we evaluate our efforts and try to explain to them and try to understand if they are getting the message, if the message is framed in the correct way, if there is if it's actually hitting the target or not. So I really think that it's quite easy to reframe the way marketing is used in a more sort of industrial sense, or in a more commercial sense, to something that's a lot more close to the reality of people who work with biodiversity and with conservation. And this really works for any type of messaging, from something that's really simple, from the Save the Tiger type campaigns where you have posters in quite a well sort of tried and tested sort of message, to something that's a little bit more elaborate, I guess. So all of these campaigns really work in exactly the same way, trying to get those exchanges going where you try to make the value explicit to your audience in exchange for a particular change in behavior. This is very similar to another tool, marketing tool that's very used in conservation, certification, more and more used. Again, certification is a way of making that value exchange clear. So it's trying to tell your target audience why they should, what they gain, what is it for them, what is it in it for them to change their behavior in one way or another. It's making that quite clear with a particular, logo. It makes it a bit more tangible. Another interesting example of this exact same thing is, and I think it's a really sort of clever example, is hotspots, biodiversity hotspots. And this is interesting because it's very often you can easily just sort of scan through it and see a conservation, sort of a spatial conservation assessment or priority assessment in this map, for example. But if you look a bit more carefully, you see that, I mean, the scale at which this is done, it makes it unusable for conservation. So, for example, I'm Portuguese, and the entire Portugal is red in this map, which doesn't mean that, obviously, it doesn't mean that someone's going to fence Portugal off and kick everyone out. It means that, in essence, it's just a very broad scale exercise. And so this brand that was created, Biodiversity Hotspots, is an excellent way for CI to be able to put together different regions around the globe. Some of them have a very high profile, like, say, Madagascar. It would be easy for CI to fundraise for Madagascar, but it would much harder for CI to fundraise for, say, conservation in Spain or in Portugal. And so by packaging them all together, CI is able to fundraise for all these different regions while, in keeping with one single brand. And the other thing that's interesting in this is that, obviously, if you want to fundraise for, say, Madagascar, if you want to donate to conservation in Madagascar, there's hundreds of organizations that you can donate towards. But if you want to donate towards hotspots, it's only CI. So it's the exact same way of creating this value, creating this brand that you can exchange with, for the, in this case, donations with your target audience that CI has created. I think it was also a really interesting example of marketing strategy in conservation. So coming down to flagship species, so I think flagship species were really one of the focuses of my PhD thesis, and I think that as things stand today, they are really the visible part of marketing and conservation. They're really one of the aspects and elements of marketing that's more visible in conservation. So flagship species are really just those species that you can see used in campaigns to fundraise or to change behavior or to raise awareness in conservation. Very often they'll be your tigers, your elephants, your gorillas, but they can be other species, of course. And in the two particular cases that we're going to be talking about, they're not any of these most popular species. So obviously, you cannot choose your flagship just randomly. Well, I mean, hopefully. And so the type of species and the species that you choose can have impacts and important impacts on how you develop your campaign and how successful your campaign really is. When I started my PhD thesis and my research, one of the things that I noticed was that a lot of the selection of flagships was really done by sort of expert opinion, which basically meant most often that you would have a couple of biologists sitting around the table, and they would sort of think, which species do I, should we choose? Well, I like this species. Well, do you like that species? I've worked on this species before, and this will sort of be the process through which these species were selected. And I think it's interesting because it's quite similar to say, going back to the Coca-Cola example, Coca-Cola deciding to change their logo or change the color of their cans tomorrow, and them having a board meeting, going through everyone's favorite colors and deciding right there what the new color of the cans are going to be. Now, Coca-Cola wouldn't do that. They would do market research. They would actually look at who buys Coca-Cola, what impact the change in color would have in people's perceptions of Coca-Cola, and so they would do some quite extensive work on how that would change. But we're actually following a lot of shortcuts in that respect. So I think, and this was sort of my initial premise, that we really needed more data. And hopefully data that came from our actual target audience, the people who we're trying to target, the people who we're trying to get to with our conservation efforts. So, I mean, obviously, one of the first questions when you get down on the ground with these issues is which species you choose. I mean, obviously, in any site, you'll have a variety of species you can select, and the question is, should you choose A, B, C? Yeah, which one should you choose? Now, my first case study was in northeast Brazil, in the state of Pernambuco, and this was in a fragmented landscape of Atlantic forest, and I was working with South Brazil, which is the bird life representative in Brazil, and so they had been doing some conservation programs in this area. They had used ant wren as the flagship for the past couple of years, but they sensed that they had done some preliminary work. They disclosed actually wasn't working as well as they thought it would, that they thought it was time to actually choose and go through a selection process for a flagship there. And so the ant wren is the one you can see in your screen. It's a brownish grayish bird. It's quite small. You can barely see it. It's very small, a very small population of this particular species. And so people were not really very connected to the species, didn't recognize it, didn't know about it. No one had barely seen it. So it has a little bit of a problematic situation there. Although this was a bird organization, so they were specifically interested in birds, which limited the scope of the selection process, we still had 240 species of birds in the region. So it was down to us to really narrow down and to select the species which would be the best for the role of flagship there. Well, of course, the first thing we did was look at the existing literature. I mean, what else was there out there of other studies that we could use to learn a bit more of how to go about this? And unfortunately, there's not a lot. I mean, there's some stuff, there's not a lot. And of course, a lot of these studies will be very, very much dependent on the particular context that you're in. And so we felt that it was time for us to develop a method that's a little more robust to come down to a conclusion on this particular question. So we used a method for this called choice experiments, which is a method from economics. And basically what it does is that it looks at how people choose between the alternatives that you give them and to determine what drives choice. So for example, in your screen, if I ask you to choose between, on the first line, say the red circle and the green rectangle, and then I would ask you to choose between the red circle and the green circle, and then I would ask you to choose between the red circle and the red rectangle, and so on, so on. If I ask you to do a series of choices, at the end, I could narrow down and understand what determines your preference. Is it color? Is it shape? Is it the order of the options? Is it, a variety of different potential elements? And you can do exactly this, but with species characteristics. And so to understand what are the characteristics that are most important, and then use that profile to select your species. So initially what we did was a series of more qualitative work, interviews, focus groups with sort of key people around the communities in that area, trying to understand which are the key factors, so with much smaller sample sizes. And then we did a questionnaire that was actually delivered as an interview. And one of the choices will look like this. It's actually in Portuguese, so apologies for that. So basically, it gives people options, two options, A and B, which we describe to them in terms of the different characteristics that were selected. In this case, it was appearance, it was population size, distribution, geographic distribution, was visibility, can you see it, can you hear it or not, and can you survive in captivity or not. So these were the 5 key things that came out of the qualitative work that people really were interested, they valued more in terms of different bird species. And so through these questionnaires of this method called choice experiments, then we were able to understand what the preferences of different groups within the population were. And that gave us something like this. So obviously, it's a little bit more complicated because not everyone has the same opinion. So different groups within the population, even within that small geographic area, it's a quite small geographic area, had different opinions of what was important, what was less important, more important. And something else I should have referred to is that we actually worked with two key groups here. The first one were the rural communities around the biggest forest fragments, and the other one were high school students. And this was because it had been one of the key audiences that South Brazil, the NGO I was working with, had been working for a long time. So they really wanted to keep them involved and have them, involved throughout the entire process. So the first group that came out of our model, of our results, was we'll call group A, which is about 40% of the population. And this group is about appearance, so birds that look good, but also birds that have small populations, they have small distributions, and that cannot survive in captivity. So this is the profile that this group thinks should be prioritized. It's most important, is the ones that are most valuable, the best, the preferred birds. And this group A is made up of mostly of students, so high school students. Then we have group B, and this group is a little bit different preference in terms of preferences. They prefer high population sizes, and again, birds that do not survive in captivity. Those are the preferred birds, the birds that we should prioritize, we should give the most attention to. And then there's these ones, are contrary to the previous one, they are mostly made up of community members. And then group C, 43%, the bigger group. Again, completely different preference structure. They value appearance, so again, birds that look good, birds that you can see and that you can hear sing, and the birds you can keep in captivity. And again, this is a group that's made up mostly of respondents from rural communities. This is interesting, this group C particularly, because it fits exactly what was predicted. This is because keeping birds in cages, or keeping cage birds as pets, is a very popular pastime in the region. And so because of this, this is exactly as we would expect. So that, again, cage bird, you would favor appearance, visibility, and survival in captivity. Exactly as you would expect.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 minute, Diogo. Could everybody please ensure that your phones are on mute?
We're trying to determine whether we're trying to get a clear and concise invoice. The other thing is, I've looked at
does anybody recognize that voice?
Again, at FedEx, but I initially do not show that we charged any FedEx shipping to your FedEx account. That's why there are shipping charges on that invoice.
I'm not sure what to do here. I think we need to take a pause for a second until this person puts down their other phone and notices that we can hear her.
Check with your accounting, I guess, the person that can get into your FedEx shipping account to make sure that it's charged. So that's what I'm looking at right now, and I don't see it, but I'm going to continue to look. And if
okay, there we go. Sorry about that.
Okay.
As you were.
All right, no problem. Yeah, thank you for stepping in. It does make things a little bit more complicated. All right, cool. So, okay, yes. So as I was saying, we had that preference structure. We knew which groups existed within the population, and that allowed us to then look for which birds within those 230 actually fit the profile more closely. And obviously, it's not as simple as we all like it to be. And in the end, what the model gave as a result, it was not one single species, it was a group of species. They got the highest score according to the model. And that means basically just that we could then have a bit of a free hand at choosing exactly which one we could choose, depending on, very specific, for example, cultural meanings that the species might have, or any other sort of similar sort of situation. So you can actually choose. One of them is the squirrel cuckoo, which is here, which is one of the most, I believe, was one of the strongest candidates, and that's why I selected this photo. The second case study that I'm going to be talking about, it touches upon a slightly different issue, which is when you have a long-running flagship, a flagship that's been used for a long time, but no one's been interested in checking if it's actually performing its role or not. So this case was a really interesting situation was with an organization, Aquasis, a Brazilian NGO as well, that works with the Araripe manakin in northeast Brazil, in the state of Ceará. And they have been working with the bird since the discovery of the bird, which is the early 1990s. And the bird has been widely used in all sorts of outreach in that region. But no one's actually looked, because the efforts have been fairly ad hoc. They had actually really looked if what was happening was, if the bird was actually working as a flagship or not. And so we set out to understand a little bit what that meant, and that was some of the hardest bits initially, was to really come down to how do we evaluate what a flagship is, what does it mean for a flagship to work. And from a marketing sort of perspective, I think flagships have a lot in common with brands. They provide, on one side, this sort of easily recognizable sort of visual and sort of mark that we can go and recognize time and time again. And at the same time, it provides us a link with something else that we can relate to. So in this case, a bird, and with all the other cultural meanings and the other connections that a bird and wildlife can connect us to. So that was my starting point. Flagships as brands and the role that and that similarity between them. Of course, in the commercial sector, there have been enormous amounts of tools developed to evaluate brands and evaluate brand performance. So I could draw from that to really try to understand a bit more of what was going on with the Araripe manakin and the outreach efforts in Brazil. Now, in conservation, usually we don't really think about species as brands, but there are definitely brands in conservation. You just have to think about NGOs, for example, and how often they rebrand. I mean, BirdLife, for example, just rebranded again, and this is something that's very common, and pretty much all major conservation organizations have rebranded in the last 2 decades. Before we get to that, so in essence, what we did was we defined our target audience. We looked at those people that lived around the most critical habitat of the manakin, and we try to do an exercise that brands often do, which is called top of mind recollection. It's basically just going in a commercial sector would be basically going to one of your customers and asking, how many brands of a particular segment, say computers or cell phones or cars, can you remember? And then looking at which ones come first, which ones come second, which ones are remembered, which ones are not remembered. And so we did a similar type of exercise, and we asked people in that particular area that was of interest, which bird species they could remember. What species it was as simple as that. And then we recorded the 3 first ones they could remember. And what we come up actually with is quite interesting in the sense that the Araripe manakin, which I should have mentioned before as well, it's quite a sensitive species ecologically, so it doesn't really exist anywhere where there's human disturbance. So around human settlements, in very disturbed areas, and so it is really a species that, unless people there's no contact with the species directly, unless for very few people who actually go to the forest very regularly. So there is a way to sort of understand where the awareness of the name is coming from. So as you see here, the manakin came 7th out of all the species that people could remember. And this is quite remarkable, if we take into account the ecological history of the manakin, the fact that you cannot see it around towns, you cannot see around your house most likely. So the fact that it does show that, at least in terms of awareness of the species, there is a considerable impact. You would not expect a species like the manakin to be amongst the most remembered if it wasn't for this outreach effort. At the same time, we wanted to have a bit more sort of a comparison basis with different species. And so what we also did was we looked at first of all, distinguish between the two sides of a brand. The first one is the name of the brand. The second is the visual side. So usually it would be the logo. In this case, it's the image of the actual bird. And we wanted to sort of benchmark these results. And so we selected a couple of species to compare the mannequin to. One of them was this red-colored cardinal, which is a species that's really common as a pet, as a cage bird in that region of Brazil. So we would expect people to recognize it, very, very easily. The next one is Quisquerí, great Quisquerí, which is again a species you can see all over even human-dominated landscapes, even landscapes where there's a lot of human interference. You can see it easily. So again, you would expect people to recognize it very, very easily, very clearly. And well, the penultimate one, the blue darkness, which is a species that's ecologically very similar to the mannequin. So it's a species that it's very sensitive to disturbance. You won't see it in any human-dominated landscapes or around settlements or around any disturbed sort of environments. So only if you really go into the forest looking for the bird would you be able to see it. So we would expect this bird to really be a little bit of a sort of a baseline for the mannequin, in the sense that we would expect it to have a recollection, or people would be as easy to remember as the mannequin would without the outreach. We also included another sort of decoy species, the hoopoe. And this was because this is a bird that doesn't exist in Brazil, but it's pretty recognizable, it's pretty unmistakable. And the reason for this was because we were well aware that there was an incentive to a point as people to say yes to all the questions. So say yes, they remembered everything. And so we wanted to sort of understand to what point that bias could impact our results. And so we included a species that was sort of there to control for that bias. And the results were quite surprising, considering how the species has been target of outreach for a long time, but it's been fairly ad hoc. But still, quite interesting results. I mean, as you can see, for example, for the name and in the darker gray, there are mannequins, clearly between the Quisquerí and the cardinal, which you would expect, but much closer to any of them than, for example, to the blue darkness. And so really shows a considerable impact. And in terms of the image, it's also interesting in the sense that although the great Quisquerí, for example, had a lot less recollection, people didn't manage to identify it as well from the image of the bird and from the name. Again, quite above and quite a much higher recollection rate for the mannequin than the blue darkness. The cardinal, much higher again, because being a pet and being kept in the house by people makes it a lot easier to remember. So in terms of setting a bit of a take-home message for this talk, if you remember nothing else, I think the key thing of this talk can be summarizing this HSBC commercial, and that is that it's really crucial for us to really understand our target audience and to really ask them the questions, as opposed to ask ourselves what we prefer, what we think is the best way to conduct these outreach efforts. Really focus on how they perceive the message, how they see the issue, how they see the potential solutions for the issue, because the same thing can be seen in many different ways by different people. So I think that is really the core of, and I think that's pretty much the core of any sort of marketing effort, is really focusing on that target audience and really understanding your target audience very well, so then you can work with your target audience as opposed to against your target audience, which is make things a lot more complicated. And that, of course, with this knowledge of your target audience, it will be much easier to find the perfect flagship for your campaign at the end, obviously. So thank you very much for your time and for listening. If you have any questions now or afterwards, I have my contacts here as well. And that if you want to reach out through email or through my website or through Twitter, please do. And I'll finish by thanking my funders that funded the research I just described to you. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Diogo, for a really thought-provoking presentation. We have some time now for questions and discussion, so let's just go ahead and open things up. To ask a question, I'll just remind you, you can either raise your virtual hand, you can type it into the chat box if you're having trouble connecting on the phone, and to mute or unmute yourself if you're not using that function on your phone, you can just press *6 if you're using it through the webinar. And please, once you've unmuted yourself, mute yourself again once you've asked your question, just to cut down on background noise.
Diego, do you have any, was there any research done, like all the logos that you showed, of doing a similar type of process for picking logos versus the flagship species side of things, but that logo side? Do you have anything on that?
No, I mean, to my understanding is that there is some research done by NGOs, but this is something else about marketing research. Sometimes it's a bit, is that a lot of it is considered to be sensitive by the people who carry it out. So NGOs, for example, would be very reluctant to share any research they've done, for example, in the process of rebranding, you know, the process of choosing their next logo. A lot of these organizations do a considerable amount of research, and you know, they do pay considerable amounts of money for this research to be conducted. But when it comes to actually sharing results and putting out, you know, what conclusions, what things they might have learned through this process, there is really a lot of reluctance to share this type of information. So although I know there is research ongoing and it has happened, I don't think there's information accessible.
This is Jenny. I was really interested. I read your paper, your most recent one, and I was interested in the different factors that you talked about with the, you know, if it's something that could live in a cage, if it was something based on geographic distribution,
yes, yes.
those different factors. And I was wondering if you at any point put some sort of conservation status, if you use that as a filter, like this is a species that is highly endangered, or this is highly threatened, or something like that. If that
that's a really great question. So what we did initially was, that was obviously very, very high on the list of criteria that the people that were in NGO, for example, really wanted to include. What we decided in the end was to break down the status into things that are easier for non-specialists to deal with. So, say for example, you know, usually conservation status is a mixture between population size, geographic distribution, and population trend. Usually, I mean, it will be like a mixture of the three, usually, of some proportion or description. And we decided to include the population size and the geographic distribution of the species, but not the conservation status per se. This is because it's sometimes I find it challenging to get people to grasp what's the difference between, say, endangered and critically endangered, or vulnerable and endangered, or even just simply saying, you know, this is threatened, this is not threatened. It can generate a bit of ambiguity. So we decided to go with more sort of tangible things like, you know, the population size, sort of brackets of intervals of how many individuals there were, or in terms of distribution, how many locations the species existed in, which was, we felt through the piloting of the questionnaire, for example, that it was something that the respondents were, you know, easily grasped, and didn't have any problem dealing with that information.
If nobody else has a question, I'll ask another one. There's been, I don't know, I know Deb Reynolds has been working quite a bit on this sort of, I don't know how new the field is, but it feels like it's somewhat new to conservation, but this idea of neuroscience and kind of the way certain things just impact our brains. And I was wondering if how that might fit into this too. I don't know if I did a very good job explaining there.
No, I mean, I think there's definitely a bit of research you know, going on in conservation. I think right now the best examples of sort of you know, things we can learn from and places we can go for in terms of drawing insights come from health field. I mean, people who work in the health sector have done a really good job to some extent, or at least much better than people in conservation have, in terms of working around behavior change and things like smoking, alcoholism, exercise, diet, all those sort of issues. The health field is really, there's a lot happening, a lot more than it is in conservation. For example, if you go to, say, a social marketing conference, for example, you will be 99% health, and there will be 1% of something else, a little bit smaller, something else on the fringes. But I think right now, I mean, there are some things happening in conservation which are a bit, they could be, I guess, more coordinated, and there could be more communication between people. But I think right now, in terms of learning and looking for examples of how we could be doing things a bit better, I think health is really the field where we could draw the most from.
May I ask the question?
Sure.
Hi, sorry. This is Sarah Cross. Hi, Diogo.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about flagship species that are not at all close to the target audience. So, for example, polar bears are used very often. Climate change here in the United States. And how does that kind of distance effect change based on the type of people that are being targeted? So in the United States, that's pretty successful, but if the polar bear were being used in a place like Brazil, where you were doing your research, would it be at all effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I should have led with probably is that, and this is one of the, well, it's unfortunate to some extent, but it's fortunate because, it is a lot of things still to be discovered, is that all of these results and a lot of the results of any study around this subject area will be highly dependent on the specific context and cultural context you're in. So the things, I mean, even forgetting about things like the difference between the U.S. and Brazil, even within Brazil, within the same state in Brazil, you will have things, examples of situations where culturally things change drastically, and one thing will not work as well as you would expect it, say 500 miles away. I think the polar bear example is quite interesting, and I think it's really interesting because he has become highly linked with the issue of climate change, and it's and then I think I think through climate change he has gained a lot of leverage. And I do think it's also one of those situations where, although people in the U.S. have a lot more of a sort of relationship with the polar bear because of some proximity, it is one of those flagships that benefits from the fact that the target audience, which is U.S., Europe, Western countries, are all countries that mostly don't have to deal with living in close quarters with polar bears, which, for example, the tiger is more problematic because on some respects you have a big group of people who want to protect the tiger and save the tiger and have this concept of what the tiger really is. But on the other hand, you have millions of people who have to deal with having tigers in their backyard and having to really deal with all the other side of living with tigers, so livestock loss and human life loss and all that. So I think that even for the polar bear, yes, but even more so for other things like, for example, elephant and tiger involved in conflict. This whole sort of distance issue is really critical. I think it's going to be really important. And so, I mean, I guess it boils down to this issue of knowing your target audience, and really before you put your efforts in any campaign, really get down to what your target audience thinks about your message and how they see your goals and your efforts and how you can work with them as opposed to against them, I guess.
Great, thanks, Diogo.
Thank you.
Okay, Casey, I have a question. So my question is more of a fluff question, if you will. I one day received an envelope from, I believe it was Defenders, and my daughter carried the post in, And she looked at the return envelope, had a picture of a polar bear floating on an ice chip, you know, out in the middle of the, and it had a message, you know, printed right on the return envelope that said something about you need to help me, or you know, it had some kind of message. And immediately, oh my gosh, Mom, we have to do something. We have to help save this polar bear. And I would love to think of a way that we could elicit that kind of reaction where birds are related. You know, and I struggle with how do we get people, you know, the polar bear and the panda bear and the tiger, they're so iconic, and you know, it's like there's a marketing message there that we just don't seem to have with birds. And what, I mean, in your opinion, what do you think would help us to kind of get that, you know, that reaction out of people? You know, your work shows that, you know, a few birds have been, the mannequin or you know, other birds have been real recognizable, but we don't, as far as I'm, you know, and maybe other people on the phone would disagree, but I don't think we have a bird that, you know, people look at and go, oh my gosh, we have to help birds, you know, when they see that, like they do the polar bear or the panda bear or the tiger or whatever. Is that thoughts about that?
No, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's interesting because even, well, I think the first thing it's interesting is the fact that even things that we now hold as being, you know, highly charismatic, say bears, for example, actually they haven't been seen as charismatic for that long. I mean, with the bear specifically, there's a really interesting sort of link with, you know, U.S. history and President Roosevelt going bear hunting and not wanting to shoot a particular bear, and then which then the press made into a big thing and generated the first teddy bear, a toy, and that was really when the image of bears really turned around, and they really started to be seen as not as necessarily, you know, beasts that need to be tamed, but as something that you can, something iconic, something representative of the American sort of wilderness and all that. So I think there's two things there. I mean, first of all is that I think that in terms of having a sort of an iconic bird that does the same thing for birds that polar bear does for, I guess, for mammals or for climate change. I guess it has to do with, I don't think there's anything inherent, I don't think there's any inherent limitation of birds as a group that does not enable them to get to that same status. And I think, I mean, for example, out of the top of my head, the charity with the most members in the UK, for example, the conservation charity with the most members is the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and by a long stretch. So I really think there is definitely, you know, that potential to capitalize on people's relationship with birds to get them interested in conservation and in bird conservation. I don't know exactly. I mean, I am a little bit. I lack knowledge of the U.S. Sort of situation, but I guess one aspect that has benefited the polar bear is there's two situations. First is this link with climate change, which is a sort of a very broad catch-all sort of issue that also has a lot of human implications. So it is in terms of messaging around climate change, it's easier to sort of package that message. And also is the fact that a very big conservation NGO, in this case WWF, has been actively backing the use of the polar bear as a flagship, and I think that support and that continued, use and sort of messaging around the polar bear has really made it a lot more, even more present in people's, minds. And so I think there's probably, in the case of the polar bear, there's those two things. But I think in terms of the birds, if something was to happen at the same scale as the polar bear, I think it would probably require a coordination between different organizations that work with birds to really have a strategy that's a single strategy towards promoting bird conservation, so they can focus on specific icons and specific sort of ways of presenting their message, in particular, in maybe specific species, say, so that this could have even more impact.
Thank you for that. I think the coordination among all of the bird conservation groups and conservation groups in general would certainly be a challenge. So I think there's a lot of challenges that would need to be overcome to kind of come up with that one iconic type of bird. But when I saw my daughter's reaction to that, I just thought, boy, if we could have that in the birding world, wouldn't that be helpful? So thanks.
No, I mean, the other thing I just wanted to tap on to what you just said. I mean, I just wanted to, it doesn't really need to be a single species per se. It could be, say, depending on the profile of the different audiences you're trying to target in different places, it could be a different bird in different regions or a different set of birds in different regions. I guess it's just a matter of the coordination sort of aspect as well, which I guess also links with the question I received here, how to couple marketing of non-flagship species, so things like habitats, with what the things that I've just been talking about. And I guess one of the interesting things of the example that I've talked about in terms of hotspots is that hotspots are not a species. And so I really don't think there's anything fundamentally different from, for example, the research side of what I did. I could have done exactly the same thing with habitats or with protected areas or with any other type of sort of conservation entity, I guess. I mean, there's definitely scope to use habitats as flagships, to use particular landscapes as flagships. So I think we shouldn't stick too close to species specifically, and there's definitely possibilities to brand other aspects of biodiversity and to use them as flagships for conservation.
Cool. Thank you.
So there's another question in the chat that just came in from from Sarah, and this, we can certainly, it would be great to have your input, and then if other people have thoughts on that, we could have a little bit of discussion.
So this is interesting. I'm also doing some work now on, for example, using celebrities to endorse conservation messages. And this is definitely something that is, you can see a lot of the more sort of commercial sector doing. And it is, for example, a good example of that would be sort of Leonardo DiCaprio and CI, for example, who've been associated for a long time. I think there's definitely, the use of celebrities and endorsements or linkages with, say, other organizations it has a more sort of a strategic component, because obviously there are certain things that you have to bear in mind with, for example, say, celebrities. If you link up with a particular celebrity, then the image of your organization then is linked up with that particular celebrity. So if there is all of a sudden there's a big, say, a scandal of some sort, say, Tiger Woods, say, any sort of situation where it might be, public backlash against a particular celebrity, you might see yourself in a more vulnerable position as well. So I guess there's a lot of sort of strategic sort of aspects about partnering with celebrities. I think that there definitely have been many examples of conservation organizations using celebrity engagements to really get a lot of projection, and certainly they can really boost your outreach efforts, particularly when you're trying to reach audiences that are very vast in very widespread sort of geographic areas, for example. So that's definitely a very interesting tool, but it is a tool that I think needs to be used very strategically. And again, and I might repeat this yet again, but when you choose, for example, your celebrity, you need to be really aware of your audience and what type of celebrity really resonates with your audience, and how should you frame this engagement and this sort of endorsement that the celebrity is giving you for your work or your message or whatever it is. So that it's really essential that link and that frame is done correctly, so that your target audience really takes the message on board. All right, there's another one on chat. I would give an example about use branding to highlight biodiversity. Biodiversity is a tricky thing, because it it means everything and nothing at the same time. So it's a difficult thing to brand. But I mean, the example that comes to mind when it comes to branding would be, say, let me try to find an example. So the IUCN, for example, is now as a campaign that is there's a little bit related to that, I guess. There's a lot of branding techniques. So the campaign is called Love Not Loss, and the campaign revolves all around positive messaging around biodiversity. So it revolves around looking at how we can portray biodiversity conservation in a more positive light, staying away from sort of doom and gloom, and really portraying a positive sort of message. So that's one campaign I would think about biodiversity sort of in general. In more specific examples, say, you know, if you boil it down to the species level, which is I cannot think of any really general examples. There's one example that comes to mind, but it's species specific, which is the bilby in Australia. So the bilby in Australia, so bilby is a marsupial, it's a small marsupial, and the way it's been branded in Australia is it's been branded as the replacement for the Easter bunny. So it's the Easter bilby. So the rabbit is introduced, it's invasive in Australia, so it's been branded as the replacement of the Easter bunny in Australia. And so there's been a lot of work done around using this Easter bilby as a brand for eradication of rabbits in Australia, for conservation of marsupials. So there's been a lot of that branding work, and it's possibly one of the best in terms of branding. It's possibly one of the best examples of that I can think of. The other one I could think of in terms of branding, it is a little bit more general in scope, but it also uses a species, is possibly Smokey the bear, and the U.S. Forest Service, I believe, and with fire and the wildfires. That's possibly another interesting example that relates to it relates to a sort of a broader, not just a particular species, broader natural areas and landscapes, but it also uses a specific species, in this case the bear, as sort of the branding element. Oh, you see, yeah, this is a really good question about migratory species, using a flagship around migratory species. I cannot say that out of the top of my head. I cannot say that I can give you any examples of flagships that have been used across migratory routes. I guess, as you rightly point out, it's particularly challenging the use of migratory species around which are migratory, because they encompass multiple cultures as target audiences. This is not a specific challenge that I've come across before, and I think obviously it will be more complicated. The one thing I would say though is that there's no need. Say if this is about, say, a particular migratory route or particular say natural spaces that are important for migratory birds, there's no reason why you couldn't actually develop separate campaigns in separate places, which might highlight different species and all that, according to the different target audiences' preferences. So there's no, of course, this in terms of say the logistics, the financial and all that, there will be a bit bigger, but there is no reason why you need to have a sort of one-size-fits-all type strategy. You could actually have sort of separate strategies, or sort of more flexible strategies that can adapt to local contexts across the different migratory pathways. Say, for example, particularly if they're very big, if they cross countries that have very big cultural differences, say, it will probably be the best to be a bit more flexible and to really adapt to the local contexts of the different places.
Okay, we have a number of questions that are coming in. It seems like some of them are getting sent directly to you, so it might be good to read those questions before you answer.
Sorry, I didn't notice. Yes, you're right. Yeah. Okay, so this one is to everyone. Okay.
So there's the next one is just from Nathan. He's wanting to know how the organizations might be interested in growing the brand of their organization, but they also might be interested in marketing to change human behavior or to conserve biodiversity. And his question is about how do you examine those priorities or incentives for conservation groups when they might be doing both of those things, or they want to do one of those things versus another.
Yeah, so this is interesting in the sense that I came across very different uses of flagship species, for example, when in conservation. So there's, as you say, Nathan, there's there are situations where clearly organizations are campaigning, for example, for extra members, and situations where they're fundraising for specific projects, or situations where they're just fundraising at large, and then they will administer the funds in whichever ways they feel it's best. I do feel that it's quite a challenge, and I think that some organizations have definitely chosen one over the other. So, for example, say CI has adopted a very different type of fundraising technique. It's not a membership based organization. It's it gets its funds from very different types of donors, much bigger donors, and that frees it from having to do all that sort of marketing to grow their brand, sort of grassroots level. And on the other hand, you have organizations like WWF that need to do all that brand sort of growth, and at the same time had to try to engage at sort of a higher level. But having said that, I accept there's a few small, I guess there's some examples, there's some big examples, but a lot of these very big conservation NGOs don't really engage a lot with the human side of conservation. If you go to some of these websites, say WWF, CI, the WCS, there's really not a lot of the people-based stuff that happens around, and so I think really that about 2/3, 3/4 more of the marketing you see from these organizations they're really about growing their brand and really making their brand bigger, and not necessarily just channeling their efforts towards changing human behavior, for example. I don't know if that answers your question, but let me know if it doesn't. Okay, Sarah Cross. Yes, in terms of using anthropomorphism, so I think I know that a number of researchers have quite a lot of concerns about using anthropomorphism, in the sense that it sort of portrays the species in a way that's not biologically accurate. So say a particular species might not have particular behaviors that if we want to anthropomorphize that species, we will need to have the species do it. I don't really have an issue with that. I think yes, again, it has to do with the specific target audience you're working with. If that type of mechanism can be used to establish a connection between the species or the landscape or whatever it is that you're working with and your target audience, I think it's a legitimate mechanism. I do think there are again some sort of strategic concerns about how exactly how you do it, how that comes across. So I think again it is really it's very much, it's not sort of a silver bullet. It is really a way you can translate your message in a way that sometimes might work more effectively. So you really need to get down to understanding how your target audience views that message in that format, and understand what implications that might have, and if that's a positive thing or a negative thing. So I think there is a lot of again sort of more context-specific knowledge that you have to have in order to know if you can use that sort of format, sort of anthropomorphized format or not.
Are there any studies that look at the impacts of selecting, I don't know if this is the right word, but the right flagship species, that selecting this species led to increased engagement or increase a change in conservation behavior?
No, that's a really good question. So unfortunately, no, I don't think there are any studies, and the reason because there are no studies is because it's basically because to actually get an answer to that question, you would have to run separate campaigns with different species in similar sites, and then would have to have a control site with no campaign. So it becomes logistically quite heavy and financially challenging to answer that question in a way that, in terms of getting that data to answer that question. So I do not think that until now we have the answer to that question specifically. What we do know is that different types of species elicit different responses. So, for example, there's a lot of research done around fundraising, for example. So a very common experiment that NGOs do is when they do mail-out fundraisers, for example. They will mail out a number of letters to different parts of the country, and they will in the envelopes they will have different animals, for example, and they will then measure the rate of return for the different species. So there's a lot of smaller sort of field experiments that show, particularly around fundraising, because data it's more available. Actually, that there is that difference, and there is that difference between different species. Now, in terms of if you then bring it back to engagement, education, outreach, I think because very often outreach and sort of conservation education and behavior change are seen as not necessarily being scientific, not necessarily being something that's data-driven and evidence-based. I think that information lacks. There aren't really very solid, studies around those types of impacts, which I think is a shame. But unfortunately, I think that is the reality.
We've got just a few more minutes here if anybody has any final questions.
I can hand the control of the presentation over to you.
Okay. All right. Well, I just want to say thanks again for really a fantastic presentation, a lot of really good discussion, and very thought-provoking. I just want to invite everybody on the call to stay engaged and continue the discussion in the future. I'm going to put up again here our information. You can get to our website. You can sign up for our listserv. We have a Facebook group if you're not part of it. And as I said, we've been recording this webinar, and I would say within the next week to maybe 2 weeks at most, we'll have a recording of it available on the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative YouTube channel, and the link is right there. We have these webinars every 2 months on the first Wednesday of the month, so our next webinar will be on August 6th at the same time, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. And thanks to Diogo for a fantastic presentation, and thanks
you for having me.
Thanks to everybody else for your participation. We hope to see you again in August.
Thanks, Diogo.
Thank you very much.